Welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host, Chris. When it comes to long-running serialized superhero comics, there's a challenge that can become an opportunity. Finding a way to take all those decades of history and condensing them so that you can find a natural jumping-on point for new readers. And there's several ways that writers and artists have tackled that. There have been trade paperback collections and reprints of the best stories, iconic tales that have stood the test of time. There are reboots where things start fresh, stuff like DC starting over with Crisis on Infinite Earths or New 52, or Marvel's Ultimate Universe. And I'll shout out Ed Piskor's cool idea of X-Men Grand Design, where he recapped all the biggest moments in chronological order while cutting out the subplots and stories that just didn't go anywhere. One of my favorites? Spider-Man Life Story, a 6-issue series that looks at the most important events in Spider-Man's published history across 6 different decades, with the additional conceit of asking us, what if Peter Parker became Spider-Man in the 1960s, but then aged in real time? Therefore, Spider-Man's history becomes the background of a story asking about the nature of responsibility and looking at the question of, do people change? It's fantastic. It's an amazing achievement by writer Chip Zdarsky and artist Mark Bagley. I think that it's time that we all take a close look at Spider-Man, this particular story, and what the creative team brought to the equation that elevates it to an excellent story. Let's level set by briefly sharing what the overall story is in Spider-Man Life Story. And while I won't discuss every story beat, I recommend reading it before continuing because, by necessity, I'll be talking about the plot from beginning to end. 6 issues of a book that began in 2019. Spider-Man debuted in Amazing Fantasy issue 15 in the summer of 1962 by writer Stan Lee and artist Steve Ditko. A story of a 15-year-old nerd, Peter Parker, who was bitten by a radioactive spider and gains spidery abilities. He quickly learns a lesson in responsibility when he loses his Uncle Ben, who raised him along with Peter's loving Aunt May. Peter had the opportunity to stop a robber, but ignored it, only to find out that that same man later killed his uncle. Spider-Man was popular because the art was weird and cool, and the character was far from the idealized Superman or Batman. He had girl troubles, money troubles, and his aunt was pretty much always sick. Spider-Man was Peter's outlet where he could do some good and have some fun outside of his more mundane responsibilities and stresses. So, in issue 1 of Life Story, we're in the 1960s, only 4 years into Peter's career as Spider-Man, and he's racked with guilt, wondering if he should use his abilities in America's conflict in Vietnam. His friend, Flash Thompson, has signed up with the Army. There are rumors Captain America may be heading over there. It's a great look at the character actually ruminating on what he should do in that era, with the advantage of Zdarsky having hindsight, as compared to Lee and Ditko being in the moment, and being unsure of what would happen, and what would they do with the character against such a huge event. But, while each issue is interesting in and of itself, Life Story builds into something I would argue is bigger than the sum of its parts. Because issue 2 jumps forward 11 years, and we see that time has changed the character in a way that an ongoing serialized story for superheroes rarely gets to play with. Issue 2 is set in 1977, and Peter is out of college and a young working man. He's got a job as a scientist. He's got a steady girlfriend with Gwen Stacy, and he's pretty much figured out how to balance being Spider-Man with being Peter. The Spider-Man comics of the 70s were a lot of fun, had great art, but a lot of the stories were repeating the melodrama that the book had perfected. There were 2 things that happened in the 1970s that would prove to be useful story beats for the future, however. The death of Gwen Stacy, Peter's girlfriend, and a one-off story where his professor made a clone that he had to battle. Life Story finds a twist to this story where the professor reveals he cloned Peter and Gwen, But he was keeping the original Gwen for himself in stasis, and she is killed while Spider-Man fights the Grey Goblin, son of his enemy Norman Osborn. The clones of Peter and Gwen decide to start a new life with new identities, driving Peter into his friend Mary Jane's arms. Issue 3 jumps forward to 1984 and uses the Secret Wars event and Spider-Man's final battle with Kraven as the starting point. But where Peter was buried alive for a week or so in the original Kraven's Last Hunt storyline, in Life Story, Peter is gone from Mary Jane while she's giving birth to twins for 5 weeks due to both Secret Wars and being taken out by Kraven, who is trying to prove he is the superior Spider-Man. The comics show us some believable and sometimes surprising changes for a wide variety of characters. Mary Jane goes from a nightclub partier to a devoted mom. Reed Richards has devoted himself to science and improving the world through that, so much that he's driven away his family in the Fantastic Four. And Peter has to make the big decision of should he turn in Norman Osborn, who knows his secret identity, but he also is the Green Goblin. Well, yeah, Peter decides that it's the right thing to do, and that has ramifications eventually in the story. I think one of the most interesting ideas, though, and it's really on the fringes of the storyline, but it's set up right in issue 1, is that Iron Man and Captain America are slowly being pushed to opposite ends of the political spectrum. And we can see that the seeds are being sown to harvest the inevitable Civil War storyline. There's a lot of preparation and planning involved. Issue 4 of Life Story jumps to the 90s, which had the infamously long Spider-Clone saga. The version in Life Story condenses all of that and reveals that Peter has been the clone for the last 20 years, and he ultimately swaps places with his clone to give him the life that he's earned, including running a successful business. They're the same person, really. It also features a touching goodbye to Peter's friend Harry Osborn, which was one of the better stories in the comics at that time by J.M. DeMatteis and Sal Buscema. Issue 5 moves into Endgame territory, set in 2006, and covers another 2 events from that decade. New villain Morlun feeds on Spider-Man across dimensions and goes after Peter's children. Meanwhile, Peter is busy because he has to choose a side in the battle between Captain America and Iron Man. And finally, issue 6 introduces Miles Morales, the Spider-Man from the Ultimate Universe, in a story set in 2019. Then the present day of the comics. An older Peter employs Miles, and they go on a mission to a space station, only for the book to do a riff on the Superior Spider-Man storyline where Dr. Octopus has secretly placed his mind in Miles' body. There's a fight, there's a return of Venom, and there's a more than satisfying conclusion to Peter's life story. So it probably seems like I just gave you the whole story, and I did give you a lot. But I promise, these are big, thick issues, and there's a lot of stuff happening that I'm not covering. We're talking about motivations, little twists, subplots, trying to tell you as little as necessary, but we do need to have a basis if we're going to analyze the techniques that writer Chip Zdarsky used to come up with this story. If you know anything about Chip Zdarsky, the person, it's that he's very funny. If you don't know him, you may not know that the name Chip Zdarsky started as a pseudonym for writer and artist Steve Murray, who broke in as a writer and cartoonist in publications like The National Post back in the 2000s. Here's an article about their staff cartoonist rappelling from their building for charity in a Spider-Man costume. He created the name Chip Zdarsky to have another name for doing his more underground comic strips like Prison Funnies. To get an idea of who Chip is, here is a clip of him on his YouTube channel doing a deadpan delivery where he calls out fellow Marvel writer Ryan North.
And at one point during his talk, he pronounced Namor, Namor. He did it in front of the whole room, and everyone was just stunned. And they were like, sorry, did you say Namor? And he's like, yeah, like Prince Namor, the Submariner. And everyone had to correct him. And it was awkward, and it was weird, and I don't know, personally, I don't feel like someone who pronounces it Namor should be writing that book.
I mentioned Chip's sense of humor to point out that when he writes crime fiction like Daredevil or Newburn, or he writes and draws drama stories like Public Domain, he isn't leaning into his natural proclivities. He puts in the work. I believe Spider-Man Life Story is a great example of that. It could have been Spider-Man delivering the best quips of his career. Instead, we take the idea of a young superhero that we're intimately familiar with and see how he reacts to challenges as he gains maturity and experience. Peter Parker successfully starts a company, gets married, and raises children. As a superhero, he susses out his enemy's subterfuge a lot faster than a typical Spider-Man adventure. But that just makes sense if he's been doing this for 20, 30, 40 years. There are a lot of small moments that built to something special for me. Mary Jane having to watch out for Aunt May, who is clearly battling senility and dementia. Captain America leaning hard into fighting for freedom and opportunity that America can represent without feeling obligated to follow his government's orders. I thought that even though the riff on Civil War was mostly happening between the panels, it had shown how Captain America and Tony Stark were pushed to very different corners over a number of decades, not just one disagreement. This isn't a realistic world like something out of Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' Watchmen. Spider-Man still joins in a battle in outer space with Kang the Conqueror and Doctor Doom. But it is a world where people have the opportunity to change, which I would argue happens slowly, if it happens at all, in real life. Craven's desperate attempt to prove that he can be better than Spider-Man makes a lot of sense if he is getting older and feels his life drawing to a close without having anything to show for it. Chip's first big comic break was back in 2013 when he was the artist and co-creator of the comic Sex Criminals with co-writer and co-creator Matt Fraction. And by 2019, when Life Story came out, he had a wide variety of opportunities and was actually the writer on Peter Parker's Spectacular Spider-Man. In fact, in 2019, he won both an Eisner Award and a Schuster Award for his work in that title. And I look at Spider-Man Life Story, which is all about growth and change and maturity, and I wonder if the Chip Zdarsky from nearly 2 decades earlier could have written the same story, or at least the same story with the same gravitas. I can only guess. But it seems to me that it happened at a time in his life that really happens to all of us. At a certain point, we start to feel our own mortality, and we begin looking at both the future and the past in a very different way. Another thing that happened in 2019 was that Chip was interviewed by the Canadian Broadcasting Company. He was asked to give his advice on writing. He has some solid advice, and some of it we can see applied in this story. Zdarsky's first piece of advice is that planning is essential. The typical monthly comic has about 20 pages, and that's not a lot of real estate to introduce a new obstacle, develop your character and any subplots, and still build to a satisfying conclusion or at least a cliffhanger. Spider-Man Life Story is 6 issues with about 30 pages of story each, which provides a little more space, but because the story is jumping ahead about a decade at a time, each issue is, by its nature, telling a somewhat self-contained narrative. The conceit of having one issue represent about 10 years of character growth is aided by using the biggest and best-known story or stories from that decade. It provides a quick blueprint and tells us a bit about both the character and, on a metatextual level, something about the fictional character's real-world history. Another piece of advice Zdarsky shares is to think about the artist. The artist for this story was Mark Bagley, the man who has by far drawn more Spider-Man stories than anyone else. He was the artist on Spider-Man in the 90s when the book sold more than ever before, built on the train powered by Todd McFarlane and then engineered by Eric Larson. And then Bagley teamed with writer Brian Michael Bendis for 111 consecutive issues of Ultimate Spider-Man, setting a milestone for the longest collaborative run in Marvel's history. The man knows how to draw an exciting Spider-Man story, and also how to pace the melodrama of Peter Parker's life. With Life's Story, Bagley was able to show that he could also convincingly represent a character aging in a recognizable and tangible way. Bagley especially did a great job representing the 1960s fashion and environment of issue 1, in my opinion. And it's just plain fun to see Bagley's familiar style on Spider-Man's evolving technology, or older versions of his enemies and friends alike. Because of Mark Bagley's extensive history with Spider-Man, I think the art itself elevates Life's Story to top-tier status. With Mark Bagley on art, it means that Life's Story is operating on one more level. It's already operating on several. It means that we can look at a story about Spider-Man's history and also see some of that change represented with the artwork itself, not just the story that we're being told. It's very impressive. And the last piece of Chip Zdarsky's writing advice I'd like to mention is when he says that you need to stay true to the character. Your mileage may vary here, but I felt this was a very believable and well-rounded Peter Parker. He's still a character that wonders to himself whether he's doing the right thing, the responsible thing. But he also is able to take chances that lead to bigger things, like starting a business and a family. I believe that those are absolutely things that the Peter Parker of the ongoing Spider-Man stories wants, but is rarely able to hold on to for long before a soft reset button brings things back to the status quo. In real life, we don't get those resets. We lose people. We gain experience. We use it to move forward. As a fan of Spider-Man, I really love Spider-Man Life's Story. I think it's a top 5 Spider-Man story for me. It's a story that is a what if, but not a what if that uses the opportunity to tell a story that's not in continuity, to just wade in death and misery. In my opinion, that's a little too easy. No, instead, this is asking, what if Peter Parker was actually allowed to become an adult? What would those ramifications be? And at the same time, it still manages to have fun because Spider-Man battles Venom and Kraven and Dr. Octopus. It's got all that stuff in there. I think that this is one of Mark Bagley's best stories. I think this is one of Chip Zdarsky's best stories. If you want to see more about Mark Bagley, I've got an episode looking at his art history, so I recommend that. And if you want to read more by Chip Zdarsky, there are 2 books that I strongly recommend. Sex Criminals, which is a satirical crime story, and Public Domain, which is a family drama, but a family drama that revolves around the world of comics. And he actually draws both of those as well. So hopefully, if you've read Life's Story, this helps you appreciate it on another level. And if you haven't, well, you've got your marching orders. You really need to read this book if you haven't already. Thank you so much for joining me today. I've got a lot more episodes planned here on Comic Tropes. And until I see you next time, keep reading comics. Bye. Hey everybody, thank you so much for watching this episode. Got a few more little things to share with you behind the scenes while I thank my wonderful patrons. I really couldn't do this show without the support of people on Patreon, members on YouTube. Makes all the difference in the world. Hopefully you'll consider signing up and supporting the show if you like this content. This one, I remember I was like reading the first issue. Cool, fun. All of a sudden, somewhere around the second, maybe the third issue, I go, ooh, To me, this is something special, and I've wanted to share it with you guys for a while. There's also an annual for Life story. I didn't really go into that because it's very much its own story, but it is cool. Gives us a little bit of a story about J. Jonah Jameson. So anyway, definitely still recommended, just not essential to the 6-issue storyline that tells Peter Parker's life story. If you could get any superhero's history condensed into a life story where they're riffing on the biggest stories of the decades but also aging in real time, what are some of the characters that you'd want to see that done with? I'd be curious to hear in the comments below.